The shotgun trembled in Laura Anderson's hands as she faced the three men who had cornered her in the barn. Her swollen belly pressed against the wooden handle, 8 months of pregnancy making every movement awkward and desperate. Behind her, she could hear the soft whimpering of two small children, the wounded mountain man's sons she had taken in just days ago. The autumn wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls, carrying with it the scent of approaching snow and the promise of a harsh winter that could claim them all. "You got no business harboring that killer, woman," snarled the leader of the group, his yellow teeth gleaming in the lamplight. "Ralph Ramos is wanted for murder, and anyone who helps him is going to pay the price." Laura's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept the gun steady. Somewhere in the house, Ralph lay fevering from the bullet wound in his shoulder, barely conscious but still the only protection she and the children had in this unforgiving wilderness. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, a pregnant widow with nothing but a failing homestead, had become the guardian of a man most folks called dangerous. Yet in the past 3 days, she had seen something in his eyes that spoke of honor beneath the rough exterior, a gentleness with his boys that revealed the true nature of his character. "Get off my property," she said, her voice carrying more strength than she felt. The baby kicked hard against her ribs as if sensing the danger, and she pressed one hand protectively over her belly while keeping the other on the gun. The men laughed, a cruel sound that echoed off the barn walls. "You think that old shotgun's gonna save you? We know you ain't got the stomach to pull that trigger." But they were wrong. Laura Anderson had already lost everything once when her husband died in a mining accident, leaving her alone and pregnant on a homestead that barely produced enough to survive. She had learned that sometimes the only choice was to fight or watch everything you cared about disappear into the darkness. Her finger tightened on the trigger as she thought of the two little boys behind her, orphaned and afraid, depending on her to keep them safe until their father could recover. The standoff stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, mirroring the tension that filled the barn. Laura could feel sweat beating on her forehead, despite the cold, and she wondered if this was how her story would end, in violence and blood, with innocent children caught in the crossfire. She thought of Ralph, burning with fever in her bed, and how he had looked at her with something approaching gratitude when she had agreed to care for his sons. In 3 days, their lives had become intertwined in ways she never could have imagined. The wind picked up, rattling the barn door, and in that moment of distraction, Laura made her choice. The shotgun roared, echoing across the valley like thunder, and the confrontation that would change everything began in earnest. But to understand how Laura Anderson came to stand in that barn, facing down three armed men, while protecting a wounded stranger's children, we must go back to the beginning, to a cold October morning when desperation drove her to make a decision that would transform her life forever. The advertisement in the territorial newspaper was brief and desperate, tucked between notices for livestock sales and mining claims. Mountain man seeks temporary care for two young sons, wounded and unable to provide. Will pay generously. Inquire at Millfield Trading Post. Laura had read it 3 times, her calloused fingers tracing the words as she sat in the cramped back room of Henderson's General Store, where she had taken a job sorting inventory to earn enough money to buy winter supplies. Her own situation was precarious at best. Thomas Anderson had been dead for 6 months, killed in a cave-in at the Lucky Strike mine, leaving her with nothing but debts and a homestead that produced more rocks than crops. The baby growing inside her was due in 2 months, and she had no idea how she would manage alone through the harsh mountain winter. The job at Henderson's paid barely enough to keep food on the table, and her landlord had already hinted that her rent would be raised come spring. She folded the newspaper carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket. The walk to the trading post took 20 minutes through the muddy streets of Millfield, a frontier town that had sprung up around the mining operations and seemed to exist in a perpetual state of barely controlled chaos. Men with hard faces and harder hands lounged outside saloons, even in the morning hours, while women in faded dresses hurried past with their eyes downcast, clutching shawls against the October chill. The trading post smelled of leather, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. Behind the counter stood a grizzled man with arms like tree trunks and eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. He looked up when Laura entered, taking in her worn dress and the obvious signs of her pregnancy. "You hear about the advertisement?" he asked without preamble. Laura nodded, suddenly unsure of herself. What did she know about caring for someone else's children when she could barely manage her own circumstances? But the promise of generous payment echoed in her mind, along with the image of her empty pantry and the unpaid bills stacked on her kitchen table. "Name's Jeremiah," the man continued, wiping his hands on a dirty apron. "I run messages for folks who can't make it to town themselves. The fellow who placed that ad, he's holed up about 10 miles north of here, up in the high country. Got himself shot up pretty bad, and his boys need looking after." "What kind of man is he?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeremiah studied her for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth she could handle. "Ralph Ramos. Some folks call him dangerous, but I've known him for 5 years and he's never been anything but straight with me. Got caught up in some trouble that wasn't entirely his making, if you catch my meaning. But those boys of his, they're good kids, 7 and 9 years old, been through more than children should have to bear." Laura felt something twist in her chest at the thought of 2 young boys, alone and frightened while their father lay wounded. She thought of her own child, still growing inside her, and what she would want someone to do if she were in similar circumstances. "How much is he offering?" she asked, hating herself for the practical question, but knowing she had no choice but to ask. $50 for a month's care, plus supplies," Jeremiah replied. "That's more than most folks around here see in half a year." $50. It was a fortune to someone in Laura's position, enough to buy winter supplies and keep the homestead through the cold months. Enough to ensure her baby would be born into a home with food and warmth, rather than the desperate poverty that had been closing in around her like a noose. "Where exactly is he?" she asked. Jeremiah drew a rough map on a piece of brown paper, marking landmarks and warning her about the difficult terrain. "It's not an easy journey, especially for a woman in your condition. But if you're determined to go, I can arrange for supplies and a horse." Laura studied the map, tracing the route with her finger. 10 miles through mountain country to a place where a wounded man waited with 2 children who needed care. It seemed like madness. But then again, her entire life had taken on an air of unreality since Thomas's death. What was one more impossible decision in a string of choices that defied logic? "I'll go," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Jeremiah nodded approvingly. "I'll have everything ready by tomorrow morning. But ma'am, you should know that there are folks in town who don't take kindly to Ralph Ramos. If word gets out that you're helping him, you might find yourself facing some trouble." Laura thought about this as she walked back through town, noting the way conversation stopped when she passed, the suspicious glances that followed her movements. Millfield was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where gossip spread faster than wildfire, and judgments were passed with little regard for truth or fairness. But she had already made her decision, driven by necessity and perhaps something deeper, a recognition that sometimes the right choice was also the most dangerous one. That night, Laura sat in her small cabin, surrounded by the few possessions she could call her own. The wind rattled the windows and she could hear mice scratching in the walls, a constant reminder of how thin the barrier was between her and the wilderness that surrounded the town. She packed carefully, taking only what was essential, her movements slow and deliberate as she considered what lay ahead. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her anxiety, and she placed both hands on her belly, whispering soft words of comfort. "We're going to be all right," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince the child or herself. "This is our chance for something better." She thought about Thomas, about the dreams they had shared for their life together in this harsh country. He had been a gentle man, better suited to books and quiet conversations than the brutal work of mining, but he had been determined to build something lasting for their family. His death had shattered those dreams, leaving her adrift in a world that showed little mercy to women alone. But perhaps this opportunity, strange and dangerous as it seemed, was a chance to reclaim some measure of hope. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with the promise of snow and the heavy clouds that hung low over the mountains. Jeremiah had prepared everything as promised: a sturdy mare, supplies for the journey, and detailed directions to Ralph Ramos's hideout. Laura climbed into the saddle with difficulty, her pregnancy making the simple act of mounting a horse into a careful negotiation of balance and determination. The ride into the mountains was more challenging than she had anticipated. The trail wound through dense forest and over rocky ridges, climbing steadily into country that seemed untouched by human presence. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of her horse's hooves on stone and the occasional call of a bird high in the trees. As the hours passed, Laura began to question her decision, wondering what kind of desperation had driven her to seek out a wounded stranger in such remote wilderness. But as the sun reached its zenith, she crested a ridge and saw smoke rising from a small cabin tucked into a grove of aspens. The building was rough-hewn and weathered, clearly built for function rather than comfort, but it represented shelter in the end of her difficult journey. She urged her horse down the slope, her heart beating faster as she approached what might be either salvation or disaster. The cabin door opened before she could dismount, and two small faces peered out at her with expressions of mingled hope and wariness. The boys were thin and dirty, their clothes patched and worn, but their eyes held an intelligence and resilience that spoke well of their upbringing. Behind them, she caught a glimpse of a man lying on a rough bed, his face flushed with fever and his shoulder wrapped in blood-stained bandages. "Are you the lady who's come to help us?" asked the older boy, stepping forward with a maturity that seemed far beyond his years. "I am," Laura replied, dismounting carefully and gathering her supplies. "My name is Laura Anderson. What are your names?" "I'm David, and this is my brother Michael," the boy replied, gesturing to the younger child who hung back shyly. "Pa's been real sick since he got shot. We've been trying to take care of him, but we don't know what to do." Laura felt her heart clench at the sight of these children, forced to shoulder responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. She followed them into the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings and the smell of sickness that hung in the air. The wounded man on the bed stirred at their approach, his dark eyes focusing on her with difficulty. "You came," he said, his voice rough with fever and exhaustion. "Wasn't sure anyone would." This was her first real look at Ralph Ramos, the man some called dangerous. The father who had placed his children's welfare in the hands of a stranger. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair and weathered features that spoke of a life spent outdoors. Even weakened by fever and pain, there was something compelling about him, a strength of character that showed in the way he tried to sit up when she approached. "Lie still," Laura said, moving to his bedside and examining the bandage on his shoulder. "You need to rest and let that wound heal." "The boys," he said urgently, trying to push himself upright. "They need proper food, and winter's coming. I can pay you, like I promised." "We'll worry about payment later," Laura replied, gently pressing him back down. "Right now you need to focus on getting well." She spent the rest of that first day assessing the situation and beginning to establish some order in the chaotic household. The boys were clearly doing their best, but they lacked the knowledge and resources to properly care for their wounded father. The cabin supplies were running dangerously low, and it was obvious that without intervention, all three of them might not survive the approaching winter. As night fell, Laura found herself sitting by the fire, watching over her new charges. Ralph's fever had broken temporarily, allowing him to sleep more peacefully, while the boys lay curled together on a pile of blankets, finally able to rest knowing that an adult was watching over them. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but there was also something deeply satisfying about being needed, about having a purpose beyond mere survival. The next few days fell into a rhythm of care and gradual healing. Laura threw herself into the work of nursing Ralph back to health, while simultaneously managing the needs of two active boys who had been without proper supervision for too long. She cleaned and dressed his wound twice daily, noting with relief that the infection seemed to be receding and the angry red lines around the bullet hole were beginning to fade. Ralph proved to be a patient unlike any she had expected. Despite his reputation as a dangerous man, he was unfailingly polite and grateful for her care. He spoke little during those first days, conserving his strength for healing, but she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. There was gratitude there, certainly, but also something deeper, a recognition that seemed to pass between them without words. The boys, David and Michael, gradually opened up to her as well. They were bright children, curious about the world beyond their mountain refuge, and eager for the stability that her presence provided. David, the older boy, had clearly been trying to fill the role of man of the house, taking on responsibilities far beyond his years. Michael, younger and more sensitive, had been quietly terrified by his father's injury and the possibility of being left alone in the wilderness. Pa got shot trying to help some folks, David confided to Laura one afternoon as they gathered firewood together. There were these men who were hurting a family, and Pa couldn't just stand by and watch. But when the sheriff came, they told lies about what happened, said Pa was the one who started the trouble. Laura listened without judgment, beginning to understand the circumstances that had driven Ralph Ramos into hiding in the mountains. It was a story she had heard variations of before. Good men caught up in the situations where the truth mattered less than convenience, where justice was often determined by who had the most influence rather than who was actually innocent. Your father sounds like a brave man, she said, and was rewarded by the way David's face lit up with pride. He is, the boy said firmly. He taught us to always stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. That evening, as Laura prepared supper over the cabin's small stove, Ralph managed to sit up for the first time since her arrival. His color was better, and though he still moved carefully to avoid jarring his wounded shoulder, there was a strength returning to his movements that hadn't been there before. "You've been a godsend," he said, watching her work. "I don't know how to thank you properly." "You don't need to thank me," Laura replied, stirring the pot of stew she had made from supplies brought from town. "I'm being well paid for my services." "It's more than that, and we both know it," Ralph said quietly. "You could have taken one look at this situation and turned around. A pregnant woman has no business risking herself for strangers, especially strangers with the kind of reputation I have." Laura paused in her stirring, considering his words. It was true that she could have left, could have decided that the risk was too great and the situation too complicated. But something had kept her here, something beyond the promise of payment or even simple compassion for the children. Sometimes we make choices based on what feels right rather than what makes sense, she said finally. Your boys needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. That's reason enough. Ralph studied her face in the firelight, and she found herself meeting his gaze directly, neither of them looking away. There was a moment of connection, a recognition of shared strength and determination that passed between them like a current of electricity. Laura felt her cheeks warm and turned back to her cooking, unsettled by the intensity of the moment. "Tell me about your husband," Ralph said after a while, his voice gentle. Laura's hands stilled on the wooden spoon. She had mentioned Thomas only briefly, explaining her widowed state as a matter of practical information, but she hadn't spoken about him in any depth. The grief was still too fresh, too complicated by anger and regret. "He was a good man," she said finally. "Gentle, thoughtful. He believed in building something lasting, something that would matter. The mine took him 6 months ago, and I've been trying to figure out how to carry on his dreams ever since." "And the baby?" Laura's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the child seemed to respond to the conversation with a series of gentle movements. "Due in about 2 months. Thomas never got to know he was going to be a father." The sadness in her voice seemed to fill the small cabin, and for a moment the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the 2 boys who had fallen asleep near the hearth. Ralph was quiet for so long that Laura wondered if he had drifted back into fevered sleep. But when she glanced over, she found him watching her with an expression of deep compassion. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Loss is hard enough without having to face it alone." His words, spoken with such genuine understanding, nearly undid her composure. Laura had grown accustomed to handling her grief in private, presenting a strong face to the world while struggling with her fears and doubts in solitude. To have someone acknowledge her pain without trying to minimize or explain it away was unexpectedly moving. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it more than he could possibly know. The 4th day brought unexpected visitors and the first real test of Laura's commitment to her new charges. She was hanging laundry behind the cabin when the sound of approaching horses reached her ears, followed by voices that carried a harsh edge of authority. Through the trees, she could see three men on horseback, and even from a distance, their posture spoke of trouble. Laura rushed inside to find Ralph struggling to get out of bed, his face pale but determined. "You need to take the boys and hide," he said urgently, reaching for the rifle that leaned against the wall near his bed. "I'm not leaving you," Laura said firmly, helping him settle back down. "You're in no condition to face anyone, and running will only make things worse." "Laura, you don't understand," Ralph said, gripping her arm. "These aren't reasonable men. They're here for the bounty on my head, and they won't care about collateral damage." But Laura had already made her decision. She gathered David and Michael, quickly explaining that they needed to stay quiet and out of sight, then positioned herself at the cabin's single window, where she could see the approaching riders. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she checked the loads in Ralph's shotgun. The three men who rode into the clearing were exactly what she had expected. Hard-faced bounty hunters with cold eyes and weapons worn smooth from frequent use. Their leader, a man with graying hair and a scar across his left cheek, dismounted and approached the cabin with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "We know you're in there, Ramos," he called out. "Come out peaceful-like, and nobody else has to get hurt." Laura stepped onto the cabin's small porch, the shotgun cradled in her arms in a way that looked casual but ready. "There's nobody here by that name," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "You're on private property, and I'll ask you to leave." The men laughed, but there was something uncertain in the sound. They had clearly expected to find Ralph alone, or with only his children, not under the protection of a determined woman who showed no signs of backing down. "Ma'am, we don't want any trouble with you," the leader said, his tone attempting diplomacy but failing to mask the underlying threat. "We're just here for a wanted man. You step aside, and we'll be on our way." "I told you, there's nobody here but me and my family," Laura replied, emphasizing the word family in a way that made her claim clear. "Now I suggest you mount up and ride out before this gets unpleasant." The standoff stretched taut between them, and Laura could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool mountain air. Behind her, she knew Ralph was listening to every word, probably fighting the urge to come to her aid despite his weakened condition. The children were hidden, but their safety depended entirely on her ability to convince these men to leave without searching the cabin. "You're harboring a fugitive," one of the other men said, his hand moving toward his gun. "That makes you an accessory to his crimes." "The only crime I see here is three armed men threatening a pregnant woman," Laura shot back, raising the shotgun slightly. "How do you think that's going to look when word gets back to town?" It was a calculated gamble, appealing to whatever remnant of decency might exist in these hard men. For a moment, the leader seemed to waver, perhaps recognizing that killing a woman would bring more trouble than any bounty was worth. But then his expression hardened, and Laura knew that words alone weren't going to be enough. "Search the cabin," he ordered his companions. "If Ramos is here, we'll find him." That was when Laura made the choice that would define everything that followed. She stepped down from the porch and planted herself squarely in their path, the shotgun now held in an unmistakably threatening position. "You'll have to go through me first," she said, her voice deadly quiet. The men stopped, suddenly faced with the reality that this woman was prepared to fight for what she believed in. Laura could see the calculation in their eyes, weighing the value of the bounty against the risk of killing someone who might have friends and family to avenge her death. "Ma'am, you're making a mistake," the leader said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "The only mistake would be underestimating how far I'm willing to go to protect my family," Laura replied, and in that moment, she realized that she meant every word. Somehow, in the space of 4 days, Ralph and his children had become more than just a job or a source of income. They had become people she cared about, people worth fighting for. The tension stretched like a wire ready to snap, and Laura found herself thinking of all the moments that had led her to this point. Thomas's death, the desperate search for survival, the advertisement that had brought her to this remote cabin. It seemed impossible that her life had taken such a dramatic turn, but here she stood, facing down armed men in defense of a family that wasn't even her own. The confrontation might have ended in bloodshed, if not for the intervention of an unexpected ally. The sound of another horse approaching at full gallop broke the standoff, and all eyes turned to see Jeremiah from the trading post riding hard into the clearing, his face flushed with exertion and urgency. "Hold on there, boy," he called out, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Before you do something you'll regret, you might want to know that there's been some developments back in town." The bounty hunters turned their attention to the newcomer, but kept their weapons ready. "What kind of developments?" the leader asked suspiciously. "The kind that make chasing Ralph Ramos a waste of time and effort," Jeremiah replied, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Got word this morning that the real culprits in that business down in Silver Creek have been caught. Seems they got drunk and bragged about framing an innocent man, and the sheriff finally got the truth out of them." Laura felt her knees go weak with relief, but she kept the shotgun steady and her expression neutral. Behind her, she could hear a sharp intake of breath from inside the cabin, and she knew Ralph was listening to every word. "That's a convenient story," one of the bounty hunters said skeptically. "How do we know you're not just trying to protect your friend here?" Jeremiah unfolded the paper and held it up for them to see. "Because I've got the official notice right here, signed by Judge Morrison himself. All charges against Ralph Ramos have been dropped, and there's a warrant out for the arrest of Jake Sullivan and his gang. You boys might want to think about chasing them instead, seeing as how the bounty's been transferred." The men exchanged glances, clearly torn between suspicion and the possibility of a more profitable pursuit. Laura could see the moment when greed won out over stubbornness, and the leader finally holstered his weapon. "If you're lying about this," he warned Jeremiah, "we'll be back." "No need for threats," Jeremiah replied calmly. "Truth has a way of coming out eventually, and justice usually follows along behind it." The bounty hunters mounted their horses and rode away, but not without several backward glances that promised they would be keeping an eye on the situation. Laura waited until they were completely out of sight before finally lowering the shotgun, her hands shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "Is it true?" she asked Jeremiah, hardly daring to hope. "Every word," he confirmed, grinning broadly. "Got the news this morning and rode hard to get here before those vultures could cause any real trouble. Ralph's a free man, cleared of all charges." The cabin door opened and Ralph emerged, moving slowly but under his own power. His face was pale from the effort, but his eyes were bright with something Laura had never seen there before. "Hope." "Jeremiah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you." "Thank the truth," Jeremiah replied. "And maybe thank this lady here, who was ready to take on 3 armed men to protect you and your boys." Ralph's gaze moved to Laura, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. It was more than gratitude, more than simple appreciation for her courage. It was the look of a man seeing a woman not just as a caregiver or protector, but as someone he could imagine building a life with. "She's remarkable," he said quietly, and Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks. David and Michael emerged from their hiding place, running to their father with cries of joy and relief. The cabin suddenly felt too small to contain all the emotion and celebration, and Laura found herself stepping outside to catch her breath and process everything that had happened. The mountain air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of snow. Laura placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her, as if responding to the excitement and upheaval of the day. She had come to this place as a desperate woman seeking a way to survive, but somehow she had found something much more valuable: a sense of purpose, a feeling of belonging, and perhaps even the beginning of something that might grow into love. "Laura," Ralph's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame for support, but looking stronger than she had seen him since her arrival. "You should be resting," she said, but there was no real reproach in her voice. "I needed to talk to you," he said, stepping carefully onto the porch. "What you did today, standing up to those men, protecting my boys, I've never seen anything like it." "Any mother would have done the same," Laura replied, but even as she spoke the words, she realized what she had revealed about her own feelings. Ralph heard it too, and his expression softened. "Is that what you are now? A mother to my children?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications and possibilities that neither of them had dared to voice before. Laura looked into his eyes and saw not just gratitude or admiration, but genuine affection in the stirring of deeper feelings. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I came here for the money, to help me survive the winter. But these past few days, your boys have gotten under my skin. And you," she trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. "And me?" Ralph prompted gently. "You're not the man I expected to find," Laura admitted. "The stories they tell about you in town, they don't match the reality of who you are." Ralph moved closer, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "What do you see when you look at me, Laura?" The question was asked so quietly, with such vulnerability, that Laura felt her breath catch. She studied his weathered features, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship, the strength in his jaw that suggested determination and integrity. "I see a man who loves his children enough to risk everything for them," she said slowly. "I see someone who stands up for what's right, even when it costs him dearly. I see a father who would rather face danger alone than put his boys at risk." "And what do you feel when you look at me?" Ralph asked, stepping close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and mountain air that clung to his clothes. Laura's heart hammered against her ribs, and she felt the baby stir restlessly inside her, as if sensing the momentous nature of this conversation. She had been a widow for 6 months, had convinced herself that the capacity for romantic love had died with Thomas. But standing here in the mountain twilight, looking into Ralph's eyes, she realized that the heart was capable of healing and growing in ways she had never imagined. "I feel safe," she whispered. "For the first time since Thomas died, I feel like I'm not facing the world alone." Ralph reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and gently cupped her face in his hands. His palms were rough from years of outdoor work, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "I know it's too soon," he said. "I know you're still grieving your husband, and I'm still recovering from everything that's happened. But Laura, these past few days with you here, taking care of us, being part of our family, it's shown me what I've been missing." "Ralph, you were," Laura began, but he placed a gentle finger against her lips. "Let me finish," he said. "I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now, but I want you to know that if you're willing, if you think you could see a future here with me and the boys, I would be honored to be your husband, to be a father to your child as well as my own, to build something lasting together." The proposal, delivered with such sincerity and hope, nearly overwhelmed Laura's composure. She thought of the lonely months since Thomas's death, the desperate struggle to survive, the fear of facing motherhood alone in an unforgiving world. Then she thought of the past few days, the sense of rightness she had felt in caring for Ralph and his children, the way they had all seemed to fit together like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was trying to solve. "It is too soon," she said finally, and saw disappointment flicker across Ralph's features. "But that doesn't mean it's wrong." Hope returned to his eyes, and he smiled for the first time since she had known him, transforming his entire face and revealing the man he must have been before hardship and false accusations had driven him into hiding. "Are you saying yes?" he asked. "I'm saying that I think we should take things slowly. See how we all fit together as a family," Laura replied. "But Ralph, I care about you. More than I thought I could care about anyone again. And I love your boys already." "And we love you," came David's voice from the cabin doorway, where both children had appeared, clearly having listened to the entire conversation. "We want you to stay forever," Michael added, running to Laura and wrapping his arms around her waist as far as they would reach around her pregnant belly. Laura looked down at the little boy, then at David, who was trying to appear more mature, but whose eyes were bright with hope, and finally at Ralph, who was watching the scene with an expression of wonder and gratitude. "Forever is a long time," she said, but she was smiling as she spoke. "But I think I'd like to try." The next few days passed in a blur of planning and preparation. With his name cleared, Ralph was free to return to civilization, but the question remained of where they would build their life together. Laura's homestead near town was barely viable, and Ralph's mountain cabin, while remote and peaceful, was too isolated for raising children and expecting a baby. There's good land available near Silver Creek, Ralph said one evening, as they sat around the fire, the boys playing quietly nearby. Close enough to town for supplies and neighbors, but far enough out to have some privacy. I've got money saved from my trapping and hunting, and with what I owe you for taking care of us, we could make a good start. You don't owe me anything, Laura protested, but Ralph shook his head. I owe you everything, he said simply. My life, my children's safety, my freedom. Money is the least of what I owe you. They talked long into the night about their hopes and dreams for the future, about the kind of life they wanted to build together. Laura found herself opening up in ways she hadn't since Thomas's death, sharing her fears about motherhood and her dreams of creating a home where children could grow up safe and loved. I want our children to know they can count on each other, she said, one hand resting on her belly while the other gestured toward the sleeping boys. I want them to grow up as real siblings, not just step-siblings brought together by circumstance. They will, Ralph assured her. Family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about commitment, about showing up for each other when it matters. The decision to marry came naturally, without fanfare or formal proposal. They were sitting on the cabin's small porch 3 days later, watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and pink, when Ralph simply said, "When should we do it?" "Do what?" Laura asked, though she already knew what he meant. "Get married. Make it official. Give the children the security of knowing we're really a family." Laura considered the question, thinking about timing and practicalities and the opinions of others. Then she looked at Ralph, at the quiet strength in his face and the love in his eyes, and realized that all those concerns were secondary to the simple truth of what they had found together. "Soon," she said, "before the baby comes, before winter sets in, I want to start our new life without any more delays or complications." "There's a preacher in Silver Creek," Ralph said. "Good man, doesn't judge folks too harshly. He'd marry us without asking too many questions about how we met or why we're in a hurry." "What about the boys? Shouldn't we ask them how they feel about all this?" Ralph smiled and nodded toward the cabin window, where two small faces were pressed against the glass, clearly eavesdropping on their conversation. "I think they've already made their feelings known." David and Michael burst through the door, unable to contain their excitement any longer. "Are you really going to be our new mama?" Michael asked, climbing onto Laura's lap as carefully as his 7-year-old coordination would allow. "If that's what you want," Laura said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "We want it more than anything," David said with the seriousness that seemed to characterize everything he did. "We've been praying for a mama ever since our real mama died, and God sent us you." The simple faith in his words brought tears to Laura's eyes. She had been so focused on the practical aspects of their arrangement, on survival and security, and the need for mutual protection, that she hadn't fully appreciated the emotional healing that was taking place for all of them. "Then that's what I'll be," was she promised, "your mama and your papa's wife, and we'll all take care of each other." The wedding took place a week later in the small church in Silver Creek, with Jeremiah and his wife as witnesses and the boys standing proudly beside their father. Laura wore her best dress, a simple blue wool that Thomas had bought for her the previous Christmas, and carried a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers that David and Michael had picked for her. The ceremony itself was brief and practical, more about legal necessity than romantic ceremony, but when Ralph took her hand and spoke his vows, Laura heard genuine emotion in his voice that made her heart skip. "I promise to love and protect you and your child as I do my own son's," he said, his dark eyes holding hers steadily. "I promise to be the husband you deserve and the father your baby needs. I promise to build a life with you based on respect and partnership, and the kind of love that grows stronger with time." Laura's own vows were equally heartfelt. "I promise to be a mother to David and Michael, to love them and guide them as if they were born to me. I promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges we face, to be your partner in building the life we both want. I promise to trust in the love that brought us together, even when the world doesn't understand our story." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ralph's kiss was gentle and full of promise, a seal on the commitment they had made not just to each other, but to the family they were creating together. The boys cheered, and even the preacher smiled at the obvious joy and rightness of the moment. The reception was held in the church's small social hall, with members of the congregation contributing food and well wishes for the new family. Laura was touched by the warmth of their welcome, especially from the other women who seemed to understand instinctively that this was a marriage born of practical necessity, but growing into something deeper and more meaningful. "You've got a good man there," said an elderly woman named Janet Johnson, who had introduced herself as the town's unofficial matchmaker. "Ralph Ramos has always been decent folk, no matter what stories might have circulated about him. Those boys of his are lucky to have found a mother who'll love them proper." "I'm the lucky one," Laura replied, watching as Ralph helped Michael with his piece of cake, while David regaled a group of adults with the story of how their new mother had faced down three armed men to protect their family. As the afternoon wore on, Laura found herself relaxing into her new role as Ralph's wife and the boy's mother. The transition felt natural, as if this was always how things were meant to be. When it came time to leave for their new home, the small house Ralph had purchased near Silver Creek, Laura felt a sense of completion that had been missing from her life since Thomas's death. The house was modest but well built, with 3 bedrooms and a large kitchen that would serve as the heart of their home. Ralph had furnished it simply but thoughtfully, with sturdy furniture and warm quilts and everything a growing family would need. He carried Laura over the threshold while the boys ran ahead to explore their new rooms, and for a moment they stood together in the doorway, looking out at the life they were about to begin. "Any regrets?" Ralph asked quietly. Laura considered the question seriously, thinking about the path that had brought her here and the choices she had made along the way. 6 months ago, she had been a happily married woman with simple dreams and a predictable future. Now she was the wife of a man she had known for less than 2 weeks, the mother of children who weren't born to her, and the keeper of secrets and stories that would have seemed impossible in her previous life. "None," she said firmly. "This feels right, Ralph, all of it." Their first months of marriage were a time of adjustment and discovery, of learning to blend their different backgrounds and experiences into a cohesive family unit. Laura threw herself into the role of mother and wife with characteristic determination, but she also found herself navigating challenges she had never anticipated. David and Michael, while clearly happy to have a mother figure in their lives, still grieved for their biological mother and sometimes struggled with divided loyalties. There were moments when Laura felt like an outsider, when the boys would reference memories or inside jokes that she couldn't share, reminding her that she was a newcomer to their established family dynamic. Ralph, too, was learning to be a husband again after years of single parenthood. He was unfailingly considerate and respectful, but Laura sometimes sensed him holding back, as if he wasn't sure how much of himself he should reveal or how much he could ask of her. They were still learning each other's rhythms and habits, still discovering what it meant to be partners, rather than just allies in survival. The pregnancy added another layer of complexity to their new life together. As Laura's belly grew larger and the baby's arrival drew closer, she found herself wondering how this child would fit into their carefully constructed family. Would Ralph truly love her baby as his own? Or would there always be a distinction between his biological children and the child she carried? Would David and Michael accept their new sibling, or would they see the baby as an intruder in their father's affections? These worries came to a head one evening in late November, when Laura was struggling to prepare dinner while dealing with the discomfort of her advancing pregnancy. She had been on her feet all day, helping the boys with their lessons and managing household chores, and by evening she was exhausted and emotional. When Ralph came in from checking on the livestock and found her crying over a pot of burned stew, his immediate concern only made her tears flow harder. "Laura, what's wrong?" he asked, moving to her side and gently taking the spoon from her hands. "Everything," she sobbed, sinking into a chair and covering her face with her hands. "I'm trying so hard to be a good wife and mother, but I don't know what I'm doing. The boys are polite to me, but I can see them watching sometimes, like they're waiting for me to prove I belong here. And you're so careful with me, like I might break if you say the wrong thing." Ralph knelt beside her chair, his expression filled with concern and something that might have been guilt. "Laura, I never meant to make you feel unwelcome in your own home." "It doesn't feel like my home," Laura admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush of honesty. It feels like I'm a guest who's overstayed her welcome, trying to fit into a life that was complete before I arrived. That's not true, Ralph said firmly, taking her hands in his. This family wasn't complete before you came. We were just surviving, getting by day to day without any real hope or joy. You brought light into our lives, Laura. You made us whole. Then why does it feel like everyone's walking on eggshells around me? Laura asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Ralph was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. Because we're all afraid, he said finally. The boys are afraid that if they love you too much, something will happen to take you away, like their mother was taken. I'm afraid that if I show you how much you mean to me, you'll realize you made a mistake and leave us. His honesty broke through Laura's emotional walls, and she found herself really looking at him for the first time in weeks. Behind his careful consideration and respectful distance, she could see the fear he spoke of. The vulnerability of a man who had already lost too much and couldn't bear to risk losing more. Ralph, she said softly, I'm not going anywhere. This marriage, this family, it's not temporary for me. I made a commitment and I intend to keep it. Even when things get difficult, even when the baby comes and everything changes again. Especially then, Laura said, placing his hand on her belly where the baby was moving restlessly. This child is going to need all of us, just like David and Michael need all of us. We're a family, Ralph, and families stick together through the hard times. That conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Over the following weeks, the careful politeness that had characterized their interactions began to give way to genuine intimacy and trust. Ralph started sharing more of his thoughts and feelings, while Laura began to assert herself more confidently in her role as wife and mother. The boys, sensing the change in their parents' relationship, began to relax as well. David started bringing his problems to Laura instead of trying to handle everything himself, while Michael began seeking her comfort when he had nightmares or scraped knees. They were becoming a real family, not just people sharing a house out of necessity. The baby came on a cold December night, 3 weeks before Laura's calculated due date, in the middle of a snowstorm that made travel to town impossible. Laura had been feeling restless all day, unable to find a comfortable position and troubled by a nagging backache that she attributed to the extra weight she was carrying. Ralph was in the barn checking on the animals when her water broke, sending her into a panic that was quickly replaced by determination. She had helped deliver calves and foals on her father's farm as a girl, and she knew the basics of what needed to happen. But the reality of giving birth without medical assistance was daunting. David, mature beyond his years as always, took charge of his younger brother while Laura tried to prepare for what was coming. "Should I go get Pa?" he asked, his voice steady despite the worry in his eyes. "Yes, and tell him to bring clean towels and hot water," Laura said, gripping the kitchen table as another contraction hit. "And David, don't be afraid. This is natural, and everything is going to be fine." Ralph arrived at a run, his face pale with concern, but his movements calm and efficient. He had assisted with births before, both animal and human, and he quickly took charge of the situation with a competence that reassured Laura even as the pain intensified. "The boys," Laura gasped between contractions. "Already taken care of," Ralph said, helping her to their bedroom. "I sent them to the loft with instructions to stay put and try to sleep. This is going to take a while." The labor was long and difficult, made more challenging by the isolation and the howling storm outside. But Ralph never left her side, offering encouragement and support through each wave of pain, his steady presence anchoring her when she felt like she might be swept away by forces beyond her control. "I can see the head," Ralph said finally, his voice tight with excitement and concern. "Just a few more pushes, Laura. You're almost there." The final moments seemed to stretch forever, pain and effort and determination blending together, until Laura felt something give way inside her. And suddenly the pressure was gone. Ralph's triumphant cry told her everything she needed to know even before she heard the baby's first wail. "It's a girl," Ralph said, his voice thick with emotion as he lifted the tiny, perfect child. "Laura, she's beautiful." Through her exhaustion, Laura felt a surge of joy so intense it brought fresh tears to her eyes. She reached out with trembling hands to take her daughter, marveling at the tiny fingers and the shock of dark hair that crowned the baby's head. "Hello, little one," she whispered, studying the small face that seemed to combine features from both her and Thomas. "Welcome to your family." Ralph leaned over them both, his expression soft with wonder. "What should we call her?" Laura had thought about names throughout her pregnancy, but looking at her daughter now, only one seemed right. "Elizabeth," she said, "for strength and grace." "Elizabeth Ramos," Ralph said, testing the sound of it. "I like it." The use of his surname, the assumption that this child would carry his name and be raised as his daughter, filled Laura with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the bedroom fireplace. In that moment, she understood that Ralph's love for this baby would be no different from his love for David and Michael. The boys crept downstairs at first light, their faces bright with curiosity and excitement. They approached the bed cautiously, clearly awed by the sight of their new sister. "She's so small," Michael whispered, reaching out to touch one tiny fist with a gentle finger. "All babies are small at first," David said with the authority of his 9 years. "But she'll grow bigger, and then we can teach her things." "We'll all teach her things," Laura said, smiling at her sons. "We'll teach her to be brave and kind and strong, just like her brothers." "Her brothers," Ralph repeated, his voice full of satisfaction. "I like the sound of that." The storm continued for 3 more days, trapping them all in the house together, but creating a cocoon of intimacy that allowed them to bond as a complete family. Laura recovered quickly from the birth, aided by Ralph's attentive care and the boys' eager help with household tasks. Elizabeth proved to be a good baby, sleeping well and nursing easily, as if she understood that she had been born into a family that would love and protect her unconditionally. On the 4th day, when the snow finally stopped and the sun came out, Ralph bundled up and rode to town to register Elizabeth's birth and spread the news of their family's newest addition. He returned with congratulations from their neighbors and a bag full of gifts for the baby, proof that they had truly been accepted into the community. "Janet Johnson sent this," Ralph said, pulling out a beautifully knitted baby blanket. "And the preacher's wife made these little dresses. Seems like half the town is excited about our Elizabeth." "Our Elizabeth," Laura repeated, savoring the words. "I love how that sounds." Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility. Elizabeth was thriving, growing plump and alert under the devoted attention of her entire family. David and Michael had embraced their roles as big brothers with enthusiasm, taking turns helping with feedings and entertaining their sister with silly faces and gentle songs. Ralph had thrown himself into expanding their homestead, building additional rooms onto the house, and clearing more land for crops. The work was hard, but he approached it with the satisfaction of a man building something permanent for his family's future. Laura found herself settling into her role as wife and mother with increasing confidence. The fears and uncertainties that had plagued her in the early months of their marriage had given way to a deep sense of belonging and purpose. She was no longer the desperate widow who had answered an advertisement out of necessity. She was a woman who had found her place in the world and the family she was meant to have. One evening in May, as they sat on their front porch watching the boys play in the yard while Elizabeth slept in Laura's arms, Ralph reached over and took her free hand. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. "Every day," Laura replied, adjusting the baby's blanket. "Sometimes it seems impossible that so much could change in such a short time." "Do you regret any of it? The choices we made? The risks we took?" Laura considered the question, thinking back to that cold October morning when she had first read his advertisement in the newspaper. She thought about the desperate woman she had been then, alone and frightened and facing an uncertain future. Then she looked at her life now, a loving husband, 3 healthy children, a home filled with laughter and warmth, and a future bright with possibility. "I regret nothing," she said firmly. "Every choice, every risk, every moment of fear and uncertainty led us here. Led us to each other and to this family we've built together." Ralph squeezed her hand gently. "I love you, Laura, not just for what you've given me and the boys, but for who you are, for your strength and courage, and the way you make everything better just by being part of it. I love you too, Laura replied, the words coming easily now after months of growing trust and intimacy. More than I ever thought I could love again. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. David was teaching Michael to whittle, their dark heads bent together over a piece of wood, while Elizabeth slept peacefully in her mother's arms. It was a scene of perfect domestic tranquility, but Laura knew it represented something much deeper, the triumph of hope over despair, of love over fear, of the human capacity to create families and find happiness, even in the most unlikely circumstances. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Laura reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. She had started as a pregnant widow who bought a wounded mountain man's children for $50 and the promise of survival through a harsh winter. But what she had actually purchased was something far more valuable: a chance at love, a family to call her own, and a future filled with the kind of happiness she had thought was lost to her forever. The wounded mountain man had indeed become her husband within days, just as the story would be told in years to come. But the real story, the one that mattered, was about two broken people who had found healing in each other, about children who had gained the security of a complete family, and about the mysterious ways that love could grow and flourish even in the most challenging circumstances. Ralph's arm came around her shoulders, drawing her close as they watched their children and contemplated their shared future. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a wild sound that spoke of the untamed country that surrounded their small haven of civilization. But Laura felt no fear of the wilderness or the challenges that lay ahead. She had learned that with love and determination and the support of family, any obstacle could be overcome. Any dream could be achieved. The baby stirred in her arms, making the soft sounds that meant she would soon wake and need attention. Laura smiled down at her daughter, seeing in the tiny face the promise of all the tomorrows they would share as a family. Elizabeth would grow up knowing she was loved unconditionally, surrounded by brothers who would protect her and parents who would guide her toward her own bright future. As they rose to go inside and begin the evening routines that had become the comfortable rhythm of their shared life, Laura took one last look at the stars beginning to shine in the clear mountain sky. Somewhere up there, she liked to think, Thomas was watching over them all. Pleased that the woman he had loved had found happiness again, and that his child would grow up in a home filled with love and security. The story that had begun with desperation and necessity had transformed into something beautiful and lasting. The pregnant widow and the wounded mountain man had become husband and wife, partners in building a life that honored both their past struggles and their future dreams. And in the end, that transformation was the greatest gift of all, proof that love could indeed conquer all, and that families could be created not just by blood, but by choice, commitment, and the courage to open one's heart to the possibility of happiness, even in the most unexpected circumstances.